this last-minute threat intelligence webinar, talking specifically about defending with confidence against Log4j. I'm joined today by a couple of members of our content team, specifically Matt Keeley, the Principal Cybersecurity Content Architect and Instructor at SimSpace, and Brian Saunders, our Senior Manager of Cybersecurity Training and Content. A little bit about both. Matt's a seasoned practitioner with 10 years of experience in IT and cybersecurity. He's worked as lead cybersecurity analyst at MIT Lincoln Lab Space Research Division, red team operator and exploit developer at a large financial institution. And again, he is the principal cybersecurity content architect here at SimSpace. He's also a decorated United States Marine. Matt holds a Bachelor of Science in Information Technology from Northeastern University and is a graduate certificate in cybersecurity from Rochester Institute of Technology. He's got more alphabet soup certifications than I can probably mention today, but I'm sure he'll go over a couple of them when he gets going. Brian Saunders is also joining us. He's an accomplished cybersecurity professional specializing in agile team leadership, strategic management, and enterprise network virtualization. Brian was an exploit operator at the NSA and also an operator and offensive cyber operations planner for the United States Cyber Command. He's currently a senior manager of cybersecurity training here at SimSpace and is also a decorated veteran of the United States Air Force. He has conducted hundreds of foreign network exploitation and collection operations over his career. He currently holds a Bachelor of Science in Computer Electrical Engineering from Baylor University and Master of Science in Computer Science from Georgia Tech. He's a certified Scrum Master and also holds an alphabet soup of certifications. As mentioned before and in our invitation, we'll be presenting on the information of Log4j in two different perspectives, one in offensive and second in defensive. With that, we will turn things over to Matt to get us going in the offensive direction. Actually, prior to doing that, I have one quick disclaimer that I have to give, being the Director of Brand and Communications. While this webinar is designed to provide you with as much information as possible and that we have about the Log4j vulnerabilities and exploits, the guidance that follows is based upon the current information available. Should any new vulnerabilities be disclosed and published with corresponding CVEs or guidance from affected applications and services, SimSpace will update its training content with appropriate information. If you have existing customers, if you have needs for additional assistance, please contact our customer success team at success@simspace.com. With that, Matt, I will pass the reins to you.
All right. Thank you very much, Chris. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. And in a moment, you should see a web page with the CVE details of the exploit that we're going to be talking about today. If I could just get confirmation that we can see my screen and then you can hear me and that I'm unmuted and I hit the button correctly. We all looking good over there.
Thumbs up and good in the chat.
Sounds good. Okay. So hello, everybody. Like Chris said, Chris, thank you for the introduction. My name is Matt Keeley. I'm one of the principal content architects here at SimSpace. I'm a red team practitioner. I live and breathe kind of all that hacker stuff. So when something like this happens, this is kind of it doesn't happen very often that you see a vulnerability and corresponding exploit that are this interesting, I would say. So as an offensive security practitioner, this is kind of my bread and butter. This is what I like to do. And I'm here today to talk about, now that I think a little bit of the kind of initial shock has subsided a little bit, I think we can now have a very honest and thorough conversation about Log4j and its corresponding exploit Log4Shell. So this, my part of the presentation today will be the focused on the offensive perspective of Log4Shell, using this vulnerability to perform remote code execution on a target in a lab environment. There will be less focus today on how this is being used in the wild. In other words, how cyber criminals and APTs are using this exploit. Suffice it to say that's certainly happening, but that will not really be the focus of today's discussion. The focus of today's discussion will be the mechanisms of the exploit, breaking it down from a step-by-step basis and teaching you how this functions and giving you a little bit more knowledge about how maybe we can start to think about how this exploit is able to happen in the first place. And just as an aside, detections and mitigations for this as well are covered in depth in the second part of this by my colleague, Brian Saunders. So that is really the important part here. The hacking stuff is cool and I love doing it, but really, even as a red teamer, I'm still a blue teamer. I'm here to present the threat and present the exploit so that we may defend against it, understand it, and know how to take care of it, especially in your environments. So I will be walking through the exploit here. I'm going to do it in a lab environment in a step-by-step basis and kind of over-explain what I'm doing as we go along. And I'm trying to be good on time here because the defensive portion of this talk is very much more in-depth than the offensive portion. And then the last thing that I'll say before I begin, in the Marine Corps, I used to be an intelligence analyst. And so there are three things primarily that intelligence analysts need to concern themselves with, and that is what we know, what we don't know, and what we think. So the facts, the gaps, and the analysis. And I should never, ever conflate any of those three together. And so what I will be giving is the facts, how the exploit functions, what we don't know about it currently, and then maybe a little bit of what I think, but I'm going to focus on the first two. So in any case, if you see on my screen here, we have and this is a very good place to go to find out about any vulnerability in general, but this is probably one of the best places to find information about the exploit that we're talking about today. Apache Log4J 2.0 beta 9 through 2.12.1 and 2.13 through 2.15. So whole lot of numbers, whole lot of words. So we'll see if we can straighten that out. The JNDI features used in the configuration log messages and parameters do not protect against attacker-controlled LDAP and other JNDI-related endpoints. That's a lot right out the gate. We're going to break this down and talk exactly about what that means. We're going to see what it looks like in the range itself. So what we're talking about today, we'll go over a little bit of the 5 Ws as much as I can. CVE-2021-44228, which is what a lot of security researchers are calling Log4 shell. This has a common vulnerability scoring system score of 10 out of 10. You can see that right here. That is the most critical CVSS score that's available. Generally, what a CVSS score will indicate is how easy is it to exploit, how much damage can be done when the exploit takes place, and a few other kind of considerations. So this is as bad as it gets. It's the absolute top of the chain here. This was discovered, and well, it may have been discovered earlier, but it was published on December 9th of 2021. So this exploit is weeks old at this point by a cloud security researcher at Alibaba. And it shook the security community to the core when word started to go around. Now, what is the principal problem here of this exploit? If anyone in the audience today has ever installed Java, the Java runtime environment, or any kind of Java development environment on a computer, you may have seen a banner that pops up that says 3 billion devices run Java. 3 billion devices run Java, right? So Log4j or Log4j, you can say it either way. I'm going to be saying Log4j. Is one of the most common logging utilities in the Java language. And so if someone, let's say a web developer, is writing a website that's built in Java and needs a quick solution for a logging, something to log the incoming web requests, they could write one from scratch, and that might take some time, or they can go find these maintained and reliable source packages that are out there available. And one of those happens to be Log4j. And so when 3 billion devices run Java, and Java often uses a common logging solution in its tech stack, you can start to see that when there is a critical vulnerability identified inside of that log function, it's widespread. And so the damage that can result from that is there's an amplification of the damage, right? And so the other part of this is that unlike some applications that are kind of inside of a network environment and deep in the belly of the organization will never see the light of day, a lot of the web applications and different things that are out on the public internet may be running this vulnerable components. It may have the vulnerable component as part of its tech stack. And so one of the other principal problems here is that, yes, it's great if there are applications that are kind of away from the open internet that are running Log4j. And that have this vulnerability associated with it. But a lot of these are going to be out on the open internet. And that's what we're seeing a lot in kind of the threat research and threat reports that are coming out about this. One of the other, just real quick before we get into the lab and actually see what this looks like, one of the other places that's really good to go for this type of information is the actual, go to the source always, try to find the closest to the source about exploits and vulnerabilities. And so CVE database, the NIST, the National Vulnerability Database, and the Apache Software Foundation Log4J page itself, and you'll get a rundown of the CVE, which is, let's see, right about here. Yep. So everything down from here is going to explain a little bit about what's going on and a little bit about the detections and mitigations. So those are good resources for this type of, for the information for this. But in any case, so we have on the SimSpace platform, we wrote a series of modules that cover this exploit. And so let's get into the lab here, because I think nothing's going to display how kind of the impact and how we can perform this exploit like seeing it in a lab. So let me get my notes here. So in the lab, I have stood up a server here at gitlab.simspace.com. And so this is in the range. There is no gitlab.simspace.com out on the open internet. So this is all within a lab environment. So it's not like I'm exploiting something that's alive. That would be bad. So in any case, we've set up a GitLab server here, and we can actually go, if I open up the web browser here, let's see if I can get there it is. If I open up the web browser here, we can actually go to the web server that's here in the range. And so I'll open it up to gitlab.simspace.com. And so this is just a stand-in web application that is a GitLab server, and this is really a placeholder for any kind of web application that could be out there. And so if I'm the attacker, I'm seeing this and I'm saying, okay, this is a web application, and you know, I need to find a way to break into this. So we're going to assume, for the sake of expediency here, that we are already, as the attacker, a little bit further along in our exploit research here. And that we have identified, we've probed the web app a little bit, we've done reconnaissance against it, and we have found a vulnerable, or something that we think to be a vulnerable endpoint on this web app. So curl http://gitlab.com, .simspace.com, :8000/vulnerable. I should get empty reply from server. Okay, fantastic. So this, let's say that we have identified that this is our vulnerable endpoint. We have gitlab.simspace.com at port 8000/vulnerable. Now the idea is that if we are able to inject a certain string into the web application that is logged by Apache Log4J, what's going to happen is that, remember, we had the JNDI, the Java Naming and Directory Interface. And so what happens is the web application takes an incoming web request, and the exploit here is going to be against a header in this website that we send to the website. But this really could be any user supplied data to the website can trigger this exploit. And so what's going to happen is that when the string is received and logged, as it's put into the logging, the JNDI is invoked if it sees a certain pattern, right? So just like you can kind of send a certain pattern to maybe a Python interpreter, or even like HTML or CSS or something like that, what JNDI is going to see is a certain string that's saying, oh, hey, this person is trying to look up something at this remote lightweight directory access protocol server, LDAP server. What I need to do, now that I've seen that, is evaluate that string and see where I need to go and try to load in a remote resource at that location. Now this, believe it or not, there is intended functionality for JNDI, which is part of Java as a whole. And so one potential thing that you could do with this is you could use this to load in remote Java code that you want to debug from another application. And really, if you're internal to the organization, that's not necessarily a bad thing. You could just point it at a local server that you control that is internal to the organization and load in Java code from there. Not necessarily a bad thing. However, what happens is that if you can inject this string into the logging utility, you can tell it to look at something that you, as the attacker, control. And that's not good, because that means that I can supply a place for the logging utility to look a thing for it to load in and run as code. And then if I structure all of that correctly, I can pivot that into code execution on a target server. Now, I want to prove that this is the case by opening up a Netcat listener. So we'll do netcat nvlp, and we need the usual port 1389, the normal port that that LDAP is listening on. So we have local to our Kali Linux box here, we have a Netcat listener that's listening for any incoming LDAP connection. And so what I'm going to do is send a request to what we have determined to be the vulnerable API here. And so the request is going to be curl header x vuln header. And then this right here is the syntax to actually inject this malicious JNDI lookup request. And so what you see here is that we are declaring it with a $, kind of like a lot of variables are declared. We open up the curly brackets and we inject JNDI colon LDAP, and then we tell it a place to look. This happens to be our IP address, the Kali box attacking IP address. We will have it send to the port of 1389, the normal LDAP port. And this is just an arbitrary value for now. We'll see how we can kind of pivot this into code execution against the server. When I hit go on this, notice how down here on our LDAP connection, we actually have, or our LDAP listener, excuse me, we have a connection received from our local target. So let's take a step back here. Let's think about this. We have sent in this exploit string right here that you see on my screen. We've injected that into a header that is sent to the web server. Again, that could be any type of data that we send to the web server. In this case, it's X vulnerable header, a bit contrived, of course, but this kind of just stands in for any other web application that may be vulnerable to this. When that header was logged by Log4J, the server says, that's a JNDI lookup. I need to go look somewhere for this. It finds our IP address and the port specified, and it tries to open up an LDAP connection to our IP. Now, I'm going to Control C out of that. And now that we have proof of injection, how do we actually pivot this into remote code execution? We're really going to need a few things here. We need a vulnerable web application, which we have. We need an LDAP server to stand up on attacker controlled on something that I control. We need an LDAP server to be ready to receive the request, and an HTTP server to be ready to send, well, really serve out the malicious code that we're going to inject. And wouldn't you know it, on github.com, there are actually proof of concept code packages that do both of this at the same time. So just to make sure that my LDAP server is not up and running yet, we are going to, in fact, I'll just paste this in because it's a little bit of a gnarly command here. We'll go ahead and paste that in. So I found this on GitHub. Actually, my colleague, David, found this on GitHub, but it is a Java package that does both of those things at the same time. It stands up an LDAP referral server that's getting ready to like catch the request and send it on its way. And we stand up an HTTP server. And in between the time that a response is received and sent to the LDAP server and the time that it is relayed to the HTTP server, this particular exploit code is going to make on the fly a malicious Java file that's going to be injected into the remote target. And so the way we do that is we create a base64 encoded payload and inject that in as part of the initial request. When it hits the LDAP server says, oh, that's base64. He's trying to run a command. Here we go. It spins up a Java file for it, hosts it on the HTTP server, and then the injection takes place. It pulls that file from the HTTP server and runs it on the target host via the first injection. I know that was a lot of words, so let's go ahead and see what that looks like in real life here. Again, just for the sake of time, I'm currently echoing the syntax needed for a very crude but functional reverse shell. And in this, basically using a utility called Netcat, which we've already used here, it's going to open up a connection and read from and write to a file that we create on the file system, and then send the results through back through that Netcat connection. And if we have a listener that's up on our host, we should get that connection and be able to, effectively what I'm saying is that we're going to open up a connection on the target host, have it connect back to us, and we'll get the ability to run commands. And the way we do that is we'll have a block of base64 code here. So again, all we really need to do is stand up netcat nvlp quad 4 right here. We open up a Netcat Listener. I'm going to open up one more window here to make it nice and easy to see. And we will go ahead and do just a little bit bigger here. So again, the command for this one's also a little bit gargantuan. But effectively, what I've done is I've taken the same proof of concept. Remember that we injected into the xvuln header, web header, the HTTP header. We have our JNDI injection right here. And so what ends up happening is our initial injection is going to go find this endpoint that is being served out by our malicious Java code package that is serving out both the LDAP and the HTTP server. And again, when that base64 hits the LDAP server says, let me decode this base64. What are they trying to do? Oh, they're trying to spawn a reverse shell. I'm going to go ahead and craft the Java that I need to do that and place it on the HTTP server. And then right when the target says, hey, excuse me, I'm trying to load in code from that remote location. Yep, here you go. Here it is. Grab that Java file, run it on the file system, and then we have code execution against the endpoint. So with our Netcat Listener listening on port quad 4, we do another injection here. Let's walk through what we see in our output up here on the exploit pack. And so it gets the base64 and it says, all right, our payload, note the typo there, it's a command. The command that they're trying to run is that base64 block that opens up a reverse shell for us. I'm going to go ahead and host a Java class that we're going to host on the web server, which is right here, exploit, and then some random name.class. So it creates that Java file on the fly, host it on the web server for you. And then it says, yep, this is the code that you want to load in. The original, the target server pulls in that code. And here we go. When we look at our reverse shell here, we're going to do a who am I and a host name. And we are the root user on the GitLab site local host. So I know that was a whole lot of moving parts. I would like to just show you guys, or you all, one more thing here. And truly, I mean, this is when you get access to a server like this, just in the scope of the range. I mean, what are some things you can do to show impact?
Matt, while you're pulling up some things to show impact, I'm just a reminder for everyone, as they have questions, feel free to use the Q&A button down at the bottom of the webinar to post your questions, or put them in the chat and we'll be sure to address them as we go along.
Yes, absolutely. And I have not been monitoring the chat. I apologize for that. I like to be nice and focused in the zone for this. So again, a little bit of over explanation here. What I've done is improved my shell. When you get a reverse shell like this, it's going to be a little shaky. It's you just get the pound symbol here, and then there's not a whole lot else going on. You can actually use Python 3 to get like kind of more. They call it a PTY, a pseudo shell, or a pseudo terminal, excuse me. So this is just one way to get like a better shell to work with here. Well, what I want to say is that this is a GitLab server, and this GitLab server probably has a database in it somewhere. And so if I switch users over to the PostgreSQL user and I drop schema public cascade, I think that should do a whole lot of damage. And in fact, if I go back here, we now have a 500 internal server error. And so I have destroyed the database on the inside of that server. Remember, this is in range. Don't worry. There's no production systems here. This is all in a test tube in a lab environment. But yeah, in any case, that is the exploit. Those are the mechanisms of the exploit. So remember, when we back it up here, we really need three things. We need a vulnerable application that is using Log4J. We need an LDAP server that's going to accept the injected LDAP evaluation statement. And when that LDAP evaluation statement comes our way, we need to be able to point it at a malicious piece of Java code. The exploit pack that we use in this one builds that on the fly. Java's not my favorite language to write in, so if you want to make one yourself, you're more than welcome. But on GitHub, there are exploit packs that will do that for you. And then with that malicious code that's served up, the target server pulls that in and runs it as if it were part of the Java application itself. We get a root shell on the system. and we can do any kind of havoc that we want. And that is those are the mechanisms of the exploit at this time. Do I have any questions? Let me get the chat back up so I can. All right.
It looks pretty empty right now for questions in the chat, although as questions come up, we'll be sure to address them. And then I do have time scheduled at the end for any Q&As that don't come through. Actually, one question did come through. Any idea what a process tree for this exploit looks like?
So that's going to be 3 billion devices run Java, right? Depending on the architecture and the OS that you're running, it could be any number of things. This, best I can tell, is going to occur inside of the Java process itself. Now, whether that's on Windows, I don't think you're going to see any kind of command.exe spawning out of that. I think it's going to be happening inside of the original process. On Linux, it depends on the type of exploit here. If you fork something into its own process, you might be able to find it that way. But yes, the original exploitation is going to occur inside of wherever the Java runtime environment is executing. I believe that's where you're going to find any kind of malicious process, which makes it a little difficult because I don't really think many EDRs or antiviruses hook into the Java runtime. I could be wrong about that. So yeah, I think it's going to be inside of the Java process itself.
Awesome. That looks like that was the only open question at the moment. If we are good with the offensive side of Log4j right now, although we can always come back for additional questions, we will pivot over to Brian, who will take over the defensive side. And just as a reminder, we do have modules in our training content library for existing customers. And this is also being shared. The video of this will be shared on our blog for anybody who missed the portions of the first part of this, so that anybody can have a chance to go through the material here at their own pace as well.
All right, great. Hello, everyone. My name is Brian Saunders. Just a quick check. You should be seeing an introduction slide from our defensive module. Just making sure that you guys can both see that and can hear my voice well. Yes?
Looks and sounds good.
All right, wonderful. So for existing customers, this should actually look pretty familiar. This is what we consider a structured content plan, and it's how we present content to our customers. For people who are seeing this for the first time, a structured content plan pairs instructional content with an individual range for the person taking the module, so that anything that they do inside a range is for their range and their range only. And what it allows us to do is things like detonate malware and things like that in their range. And once their time is up, the range is torn down, and all of those changes go away. So that being said, I'm going to kind of walk through, because as Matt alluded to, the defensive, there's a number of moving parts. So we'll cover those moving parts, and I'll kind of walk through this module as it was written. So as a defender, a 10.0 CVE hopefully comes around once in a blue moon. The fact that we are seeing one in 2021 is it's crazy, and this is likely one of the largest vulnerabilities, both because of how critical it is, as well as the breadth. 3 billion devices potentially have Java installed, and therefore could potentially also have the Log4j package. So the first thing that we need to do as defenders is to verify, is our application vulnerable at all? And so Matt kind of pieced through an exploit, how you would do that to gain access, but that's not the only reason that you might need to verify vulnerability. So the first step that we're going to do in the defensive portion of this is to set up rather similarly However, we do have positive control over the GitLab server. So very similar scenario as to what Matt showed in the offensive module, but we have positive control of GitLab server, so we can actually get on the command line on the GitLab server and run some commands. So as I mentioned, this is kind of broken out into a number of different labs, and that first lab has you verify, is your application vulnerable? So I have gone onto the GitLab already, and this is currently running an application called vulnerable Log4J server. So pardon the obviousness here, but this is actually a vulnerable server. And to verify that it is vulnerable, what I will go ahead and do is very similar to what Matt did. I've set up I'll set up a Netcat Listener here. And when I curl that vulnerable web server, what I should expect to see is that LDAP query come back to me on port quad 8s in the left terminal over here. So again, all I'm doing here is verifying that my application is actually vulnerable. So if I receive any code back in the left window, I know that my application is vulnerable. So when I press enter on this, I received a connection back and I received some gobbledygook there, but that to me proves that this application is vulnerable. So once I've proved the application is vulnerable, I need to find that vulnerability in the code. And luckily, there is actually something that our colleagues have written. Let me skip to that part really quickly. Yes, so Lunasec prepared a scanner for the Log4Shell vulnerability, and what this will do is it will identify jar files that might contain that Log4j vulnerability. So I've gone ahead and loaded that on this GitLab server, and what we're going to find is the hash of vulnerable service. So as I can see, I've got some error messages here, but I'm going to Control-C out of that server. And I'm going to run the service that will scan for vulnerable jars. So it's just Log4Shell scan. I believe it's user local. And what I'm seeing here is that I do in fact have Log4j installed. I do in fact have a vulnerable version 2.14 or 2.14.1. And it is a CVE 10.0 vulnerability according to the scanner, again, written by Lunasec. So the other capability that we have to do in our platform is to ask questions about what you're doing in the range. So you'll notice here that that scanner provided a hash back. So in our platform, the very next task we're going to do is it's going to ask you, what is the hash of the vulnerable jar file? So it's going to ask me for the last 5 of that hash. And I can switch back here and I can say that's 9AE3F. And it will tell me whether or not I got that wrong. Luckily, I got it right. And we'll move on. So as I mentioned, so far we've covered, yes, we had a vulnerable service, and we figured out where that vulnerable, which files were creating that vulnerability. The next step would be to conduct some remediation steps. So vulnerabilities are different. Every vulnerability is different. Every CVE is different. For the Log4j vulnerability, the best thing that you can do is to upgrade your software. Generally speaking, when there are vulnerabilities, upgrades are the best thing that you can do. Unfortunately, depending on the environment you are in, vulnerabilities cannot always be patched, or they have to be patched on a cycle, or there are it's that one critical application that can never come down. You can never conduct that update without months of notice. That's okay. There are a number of other things that you can do to hotfix this in particular. What I'm going to do in the lab is actually conduct the update and show you that once we do the update, it is no longer vulnerable. However, we do go through some options in the lab, how you could fix the vulnerability that will essentially neuter the vulnerability, but it certainly is not the best practice to remediate this vulnerability. So again, what you should do is follow this remediation steps here. So and I will show you how to do that. We're going to install the patch essentially. So I've already put the patch here, and I will unzip it. And we're going to move that new application to the old spot and remove the old one. Once I do that, we're going to restart the application. And rather than type it out, I'll just copy and paste so that I don't make a mistake. All right, and then as I mentioned, we're going to remove that old vulnerable server. Because of the fact that when this server turns on, it's not necessarily, or sorry, the application is stood up after the server comes up. So here we are simulating that you are going to restart the server. So these next steps that I'm doing here are restarting the server so that when the service, so that when I restart the server, it brings up the new service that I just did, which we're simulating with this sed command here. All right, and that should be patched. So now we're going to verify that my patch actually worked. So remember what we did in that first step to verify vulnerability. What I'm going to do is start this vulnerable server, and then I'm going to go on and as Matt showed before, I'm going to start up a listener, and then I'm going to run a curl against what I still believe to be the vulnerable service, and we'll see if I get any communication back from the server. So there's the server started. My tab appears to be missing. There it is. So here's the Netcat Listener started, and then I'm just going to rerun that curl command. And again, if it's patched, I should get no communication back in my left window. And I got no communication back. The curl was successful. That means that the server and the service is up, but I did not receive any communication back. We have successfully patched the vulnerability. So let's talk last steps. How do you know it happened at all? So far, all we've talked about is figuring out that a vulnerability was there and determining what files may actually be vulnerable or contain the vulnerability, and then how to patch it. But how do we determine whether or not we may have been attacked already, or someone has exploited the vulnerability? It depends. There are a number of ways that we can look at logs to potentially see those queries, and I've actually pre-staged a DNS attack with this in this range. So I'm going to show you how you could potentially go and look for this attack having happened in the past. So we're going to go to the log file, and we can look for using this grep query here. We can look for a JNDI query that exists in the logs. If I can copy the whole line. Again, this is going to be on the server, so I'm going to kill that service that's running right now. And then I'm going to run a query to look for any of those JNDI strings. So this is This is a regex that looks for any JNDI string. It will look for LDAP, LDAP-S, RMI, or DNS. So those are different queries that you can run with the JNDI query. And we'll see if there have been any attempts on the service that was running logging to this location. And I forgot to re-add the single quotes. So what we see in the logs here, highlighted in red there, is the string that I was just searching for. So what we see there is a JNDI query to a DNS service running at that IP address highlighted again in red for something called attacker.com. What this tells me is that I am detecting this vulnerability being exploited. In the follow-on question for this lab, we asked what service was targeted here. And so if we look at that second portion of the JNDI query, we can see that DNS is what was targeted. All right, I have successfully covered determining whether or not your service is vulnerable. We talked about finding the vulnerable files. We talked about remediating, and we talked about a possible detection given potential logging vectors. That is the full scope of the defensive module, and I am happy to take any questions at this time.
If anybody has any questions, you're welcome to put them into the Q&A module down at the bottom of the screen, or type them into the chat. We have both windows open to monitor. James has a question. Would detection using the grep command you had show only successful exploitation?
That's a great question, James. It should show both successful and unsuccessful exploitation attempts. So you should see if those queries are being logged at all. That's a great question. The only way that you can test if you are currently vulnerable is to do it yourself right now and to run the scanner. The logging will only show attempts. Matt, do you want to add anything to that from your experience either?
In certain circumstances, it's tough because you're much like in kind of a PHP log poisoning attack. If anyone's familiar with that, when you inject PHP into a server and is run server side, the actual string that's used as the injection may not actually be there, and that's because it's being interpreted as PHP. I've seen similar results with this. In some circumstances, it's the JNDI strings in the logs that don't show up that you need to worry about, because those are the ones that made a successful outbound request. But yes, grepping for the JNDI string, I think will get you the unsuccessful attempts at the very least. And I would hope it would get you the successful ones as well. The other thing I was going to say is that CySA just put out a tool last night. I think I saw a tweet about it. That is now a payloadless exploitation simulator, so that you can send in JNDI strings into your applications and see if they will trigger a JNDI lookup. Thinkst Canary also put out a canary token, which is essentially the same thing. You can throw a JNDI string into your application, and if it makes an outbound request and hits the Thinkst Canary servers, it will send you an email and say this one triggered at this time. So yeah, look for the requests in the logs, and then actively attempt to see if your applications are able to make those outbound callbacks. You should have a pretty good idea of which ones you need to triage accordingly.
Excellent. Well, it looks like that's the end of the questions that we have right now. Of course, if you have any additional questions, we're happy to help you at any point. If you want, feel free to follow our blog. We will be posting, as we mentioned, this webinar on our blog, along with some of the write-up to go along with it, and even the a couple of links to the Canary and CISA link that Matthew just mentioned in there for lookup as an additional tool. And again, if you want to test any of your application or your space, specifically on the SimSpace range, we're happy to help you with that, and contact our sales team, sales@simspace.com. And if you are an existing customer and want to go through any of the additional training modules, not only for Log4j, but any of the other vulnerabilities and CVEs, as we have a pretty robust, as putting it lightly, library of content on there. Of course, Matthew and Brian are the brains behind a lot of that, so you'll be able to get a lot of additional training on there. Thank you all for joining us for today's training and webinar. If there are any additional questions, feel free to reach out to us. In the meantime, have a wonderful holiday break and a happy new year, and defend confidently.